Hi, my name is Sandra Jeppesen, and today I'm just going to talk a little bit about my book, Transformative Media, and I'm going to share my screen and do a lightning talk, a little bit longer than the lightning talk that I'm doing on Tuesday. So this book came out with UBC Press, Transformative Media, Intersectional Technopolitics from Indymedia to hashtag Black Lives Matter, just at the end of last year. And my name's Sandra Jeppesen, as I said. I'm in media, film, and communications at Lakehead, and my website can be found at mediaactionresearch.org. I was also the Lakehead University Research Chair in Transformative Media and Social Movements for several years, and this book came out of that work, as well as a grant that I got from SSHRC called New Media Activism in the Global Digital Economy. So the team that got together to do that research was called the Media Action Research Group. And we decided to approach research a little bit differently. So this is my methodology slide. We wanted to take at least 5 different approaches that deviate from traditional research in specific ways. So the key starting point was that we were researching with grassroots media projects, and these are often intersectional media projects. They're anti-racist or feminist, LGBTQ+, anti-colonial, and so on. Anti-capitalist, I should also add. So those were our 5 pillars. And the people that we researched with identified with these as either being something that informed their identity or that informed their media project in some way. And so often you'll read in the literature about marginalized groups and how they produce media or how they're excluded from producing media. What we wanted to look at in our project and what we had found in previous research was that actually people in marginalized groups are quite adept at producing media. And so we wanted to take an assets-based approach rather than a deficit-based approach to media production from marginalized groups. And we looked at this from an intersectional perspective using an intersectional framework. And the second thing that we wanted to do was, instead of thinking about technologies as a starting point, so a lot of research right now starts with social media technologies, platform economies, the political economy of technologies. We wanted to look instead at relationships and how relationships can actually support and be key assets in intersectional media research, intersectional media production projects. A third thing that we do that deviates from the traditional research methodology is that rather than being objective outsiders to the research, we research as insiders. So this means that most of the people on our research team in Marge have been involved in media projects from an intersectional perspective, and or in social movements, and or identify with intersectional identities. And so we have certain insights as a result of this, that people outside movements and media projects of this type don't have. It also means, there are some drawbacks. There may be some things that we don't see because we're too close to the material. And so for that, we have peer review and, we have other processes of keeping us on top of that, our external research in scholarly databases and so on. We also wanted, so a lot of research, particularly political economy research and also intersectional media research, looks at macro media. So a lot of research on mainstream media, and we wanted to actually look at micro media. So even though alternative media is critiqued for being micro, there's actually a lot of interesting stuff going on, it seemed to us, in micro media. And so we wanted to look at small media projects and to see what kinds of successes they're facing and challenges they're facing in terms of their intersectional commitments, practices, and so on. And that leads me to the last one, which is that a lot of mainstream media research looks at genres. So, is it radio? Is it video? What genre is it? Print media? What genre are activists working in? And we thought that a different approach to this would be to look at practices, media practices, and what kinds of media practices are held in common among different genres, and how do those, again, to tie it back to the assets of media projects, how do those support intersectional media projects in terms of the sustainability of the project itself and the sustainability of the activist life and sustainability of social movements that these media projects support. So that's a little bit of the big picture of our methodology. We also, since I'm giving a slightly longer talk than the lightning talk, we did 6 focus groups across Canada to start out asking some questions, because we wanted to start with media activists, not necessarily just with the literature from the scholarly perspective. And then based on that, we developed interview questions. We interviewed 89 media activists across 11 different countries. And then we also, once we analyzed the results, shared them back through 5 workshops, again, in 5 different countries. So what did we find? Well, so I tried to summarize, and it's a massive project. So of course it spills outside the parameters of the book. But what we found was across these intersectional pillars of media production, that there were many different approaches. And so first of all, I had the struggle of how to represent intersectionality in media projects and divide that into chapters that focus predominantly on one axis of people's identity, or the one axis of the issue that people are being active on. And so I took an activist approach to this, which is to foreground the one axis, but to remember to carry along with it the intersectional axes that are being approached through that foregrounded axis. So the book is therefore laid out into chapters. Of course, there's an introduction, not shown here. And then I look at the global justice movement in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and the development of Indymedia as a kind of cutting edge digital media technology. And then I break that down into different movements that took up these kinds of digital technology approaches. So I look at anti-austerity and anti-capitalist media, and one of the key players in that is, of course, the Indignados and their development of technopolitics. I look then at hashtag Black Lives Matter, and here's my timeline. Black Lives Matter started in 2013. So I look at how they developed anti-racist movements. I also, in terms of anti-colonialism, look at hashtag Idle No More and that movement in Canada. I look at LGBTQ plus rights, and here's an image of a trans artist, Coco Riot. And I position this in 2015 as that was the key year that in the United States, same-sex marriage rights became a federal law. I also look at trans feminism, so trans inclusive feminism, which came to the forefront in 2017 with the rise of the hashtag #MeToo movement. And then I spend the last chapter really mulling over some of the tensions and contradictions of our digital future, asking questions such as, if activists and social movements are relying almost exclusively, as they seem to be today, on social media, then what happens when social media starts banning particular groups, or we have shadow banning, as we saw last year in the shadow banning of the red dress movement on Indigenous Day of memory. So all of this is to say there are many questions and many exciting potential opportunities in digital futures for activists, but we really need to be attentive to some of the dominance of digital platforms and what are some of the problems that that brings with it. Because if we don't address those problems, then the digital media capacities developed by these groups may be at risk. Okay. Oh, right. And so Marge was active from 2013 to 2019. And so the book largely focuses on that time frame. And so just to leave you with a bit of a teaser, so I've mapped out some of the questions and the sort of structure of the book, but not the content so much. And I don't, of course, have time to go over the entire content of the book. So this is a teaser. One of the things I talk about excessively in the book that I do a deep dive into is intersectional technopolitics. So how do activists use digital media technologies to bring intersectionality to the forefront of their movements? I look at affective digital labor. In other words, what are people doing in terms of digital labor from an emotional or an affective perspective through a political economy lens, and how that can be very positive in terms of support, building movements, and providing healing justice for each other. But it can also be an emotional tax where people can feel like there's a lot of trolling and there's a lot of emotional energy expended, and that it's also hyper exploitative. In other words, no economic benefits accrue from using social media platforms to promote one's movement and one's issues. This leads into hashtag activism, of course, which there's been a lot of research on recently, but what are some of the pros and cons of that? And transmedia mobilizations, which are mobilizations that depend on really mobilizing media across not just digital media, but also residual media. So print media, posters, comics, graphic novels, in addition to the social media platform mobilizations. And then how are those mobilized across media technologies or media architectures? And finally, solidarity technologies, where people are increasingly developing media and digital technologies that start out with the objective of creating relationships of solidarity and generating their own platforms to do so. And this is an offshoot of the free open source movement that focuses on radical technologies and some hacktivist technologies and that kind of thing. So that's just a teaser, obviously, a real overview and not the deep dive that the book offers. That's all I have for you today. Thanks for stopping by my video, and I hope you're enjoying this virtual conference. Bye for now.